back session from the breakout groups. And as Kat said, 5 minutes for the first one, and other people only then report back if they have anything to add. In choosing the first group to present, our group came up with 4 things that didn't work well. We had to fish around for them quite a bit. Can any other group come up with more than that? If not, I'll ask the rapporteur for group 3 to kick off. And we had quite a few things that worked well, but I think the difficulty was, rather than being self-congratulatory, to look at the things that didn't work well. So can we have our rapporteur from group 3? Do you want to come out?
Hello? Yeah. So we have maybe 4 cases or 4 scenarios where the vaccine didn't work. The first one is we only had data on mRNA vaccines. In comparison, there was very little data on non-mRNA vaccines. Maybe like most of the data were on mRNA vaccines and adenovirus vaccines, but for other platforms, there were very little data. One of the negatives as well is poor quality of data that comes from some settings where like there is poor definitions of case fatality rates or poor definitions of infections. Also, the third case where real-world evidence was not optimal for signals for some adverse events, because we noticed delayed reporting of some of the serious side effects with adenovirus vaccines. And finally, there is little data on transmission from little data on the effectiveness of the vaccines on preventing transmissions. And there are some challenges in conducting such studies as well. That's what did not work from our team.
But the good things, the rest was all good. They had a list of information that came from real-world evidence that wouldn't have otherwise been generated.
Yeah,
that fed back into policy. Do you want to read those out as well?
The positive ones as well?
Yeah, the positive ones as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, some of the positives were to determine when to vaccinate, especially like the between doses intervals. Like early on, we started with a shorter interval, but then as real-world evidence accumulated, we knew probably it's better to have like a better tuning of dosing time. There is another positive, which is number of doses, especially the boosters. And as we learned from like the Danish, Israeli data, that guided policies towards the 3rd dose and maybe more booster doses. Interchangeability of vaccines, like switching from adenovirus to an RNA and vice versa. Probably real-world evidence was the best data for like on interchanging between vaccines. Special populations like immunocompromised or patients with renal impairment, end-stage renal disease, and The fifth point is vaccines updated variances like seasonal ones. Now we only rely on real world evidence to infer effectiveness. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think, Hector, you thought it was the myocarditis signal that was picked up late, because I think the TTS signal picked up pretty quickly, but you felt the myocarditis one could have been picked up earlier. Do you want to use your mic? Oh, you haven't got one. But is that a yes?
Hello? The incidence rate of myocarditis does not justify any delay once you start using the vaccine in millions of people. That's all. So we did delay on myocarditis, clearly. TTS was much more rare, and it would have been difficult to get there in time. But for myocarditis, I think we could have done a better job. We didn't expect that. That's part of the problem. We didn't know the interval. We didn't know the mechanism. There are good reasons to justify the delay, but the incidence was not so low for young adults, 18, 16 to 17, 18 to 20, 21, 22, 25. There was data. We just delayed a little bit, I would say. As I said, we had no suspicion. We didn't expect it. We did not suspect the mechanism. There were a number of reasons. I don't know if Tom Shimbabukuru would like to comment a little bit more on that, maybe.
Well, maybe we better move on, because there's 8 other groups. So we've got 5 worked well and 4 didn't. What we considered in group 3 didn't work so well. Yeah. Sorry? Mike, to the other rapporteurs, yeah. So who's the next to report? Bill? What can you add?
What can I add? Oh, I'm not sure. Now, let me see. We ran out of time, so I think the main reflections was, there was obviously a legacy built in the pandemic for data, infrastructure and linkage that we need to sustain. And I think the reason we reflected on that is because we're talking here about pandemic authorization. But all of this really, we've got to think about how we apply this and take it forward to routine vaccines and getting, normal, non-emergency vaccines deployed quicker, as well as the emergency situation. So I think the overall reflection there is we need to build on the lessons in the infrastructure and not just think about pandemic, but think about other vaccines. I think also reflecting, we didn't hear too much today about the use of real-world evidence in the authorizations in the pandemic. It was all clinical trial data. We've heard about real-world data in the life cycle management and the boosters and the safety, but we didn't really hear anything about the authorizations themselves. So I think that's something that we probably need to reflect on, is how we can integrate real-world data into the initial authorization process. So that's in some ways a lesson that needs to be learned. I think in terms of what inappropriate decisions, we couldn't really come up with an answer to that, but I think we do need to reflect on how we looked at some of the safety issues initially. I don't think observed expected methodology was the right way to look at TTS because of a lack of a background. Individual case causality assessment might be better there, but it wouldn't work for myocarditis. So there's all sorts of lessons for safety, and we could come back to that, I think, in the next breakout. In terms of weaknesses, I think that we need to plan for better, probably by integrating real-world data into our plans, is safety in pregnancy. It took a while to get data there. We should probably anticipate that more quickly. And I think the other issue, because a lot of these safety issues had an age-specific risk and the burden of disease had an inverse age-specific risk. Again, particularly in children, having a better plan to focus on children, and also a better plan to look at, to monitor the impact of viral transmission and the other impacts of vaccination, just to look at benefit risk, from the broader context. So that's really looking at from the real world point of view and how we can get better at integrating real world into our pre-authorization planning. Yeah, I think they're the main points. Thanks.
Thanks, Phil. What group we got next? There's some nice generic points there, particularly about use of real-world evidence feeding back or even accelerating the licensure process, which we really haven't got any example. We didn't do that in the pandemic. Miriam.
Yes, thank you. We have some additional points, I think, and that's the great data coming from Israel that actually informed many of the booster campaigns, actually, as part of the real-world evidence. Also, I think what could be improved or would be desired to be improved is the discordancy between countries in how they took decisions, especially about the safety concerns related to the TTS and what they did to the campaign. So we see that EMA launches one advice, and then every country actually takes a different public health advice based on the same data, and this causes questions in the public. So I think that's something to be looked at. Then, of course, the good thing also was the collaboration around the pregnancy studies in the Sea Viper, although it's not clear yet whether that's successful because they haven't finished yet, but at least there was collaboration on that end. And I think also the group recognized that in comparison to the H1N1, that the infrastructures and the speed by which real-world evidence actually is generated has increased quite a lot. So that's a good thing. Did any of my group members adding?
Which group is it?
Group 5. So for the group 5, one additional point we wanted to add is also the political influence on the willingness to have studies or real-world evidence out there. So that's also a point we found negative. And on the positive things, we had some additional points on what went well, and we find that the rolling review that was done was something that was really appreciated. And also the transparency of some regulatory bodies with online meetings that were that people could follow from all over the world was something that was really positive. So that's.
What did you mean by political influence on?
Well, if a decision,
well,
you have the regulatory bodies and they make decisions on what could be good and what could be the vaccines of interest. And sometimes there is also the political influence. If you have a decision made at the political level, then you could not maybe change it afterwards, even though other information became available.
Example here?
Well, there are examples, but I cannot comment on examples, but sometimes we need to take into account that you need also have a good collaboration with your government.
Is Julia from group?
I'm the online group, so I want to represent the people not in the room. So I think there's just two things that we had a broad discussion, but we were thinking about the lack of pregnancy data that was available. So we were thinking about data that wasn't available, and the lack of pregnancy data, as we probably all know, is very difficult to come by and get good, robust data. So, but I think that really impacted on the uptake of the vaccine in pregnant women, I think, in the UK. And so that would be on a wish list to get better safety and effectiveness data in pregnancy. And then we also discussed the immunosuppressed group, which is also another tricky group in real-world data. The definition of these groups, because it's a very broad spectrum of people, the immunosuppressed, a wide spectrum, going from the very severe to the not so severe, and thinking about what's needed in that group. And often ICD coding and other drug codes, we just group them all together. So that may not be the most appropriate thing to do. So we had some discussion around that. So there too, we need to work on, I think.
That's interesting, because the generation of immunosuppressed data was one of the things that our group considered was done rather well.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Hector.
Hector, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I admit we didn't have enough data on immunosuppressed, but on the other hand, I completely agree with you that we, in each study, we define who is immunosuppressed differently. The results are radically different. I could elaborate, or if anybody wants to discuss with me privately, I have the list of all the mistakes I have made in studies in which I have participated. I will gladly share.
Rebecca, your group?
I'm group 2, and I think that our group took a bit of a, we didn't talk about individual decisions or subgroups. We were more high level, I think. And I think that a lot of the themes that we discussed, I've already heard, but there's one very important one that I think deserves a shout out to the group, and that's the importance of communication, particularly when it comes to real world evidence. I'm so sorry. We had a experience from Nigeria that, you know, really Nigeria was not in a position to actually generate real world data or real world evidence because of a mistrust from the government. So to start out, you know, planning to use real world evidence for decision making is a bit of a social contract with your population because they have to buy into it to participate in the generation. So starting out with communicating and gaining the trust of your population is critical to the generation of real world evidence. And then we talked about the challenges in communicating real world evidence. We definitely all agreed that it was much harder to communicate the results and the conclusions and the implications of real world evidence compared to randomized clinical trial data. And we saw that there were many mistakes made in that communication, but we recognize that it's incredibly challenging. And as far as I know, I don't know if we've actually sat down and really thought at that very nuanced level about communicating different types of evidence and how we do that.
Thank you.
Not sure if I'm the last group or not, group 4.
Is
so
Nick,
not
who's generated a lot of the real world evidence. Some was generated outside Israel, I should say.
Yeah, Israel, I think just ahead of the UK. One of the things we talked about actually was about speed quite a lot, and that was, you know, quite a key thing. You know, although some was done fast, not everything could be looked at quickly, and not every country was able to do studies quickly, so there was a reliance on others. Well, now that's maybe fine if the population's reasonably representative of your own. I mean, we had a good point that sort of from Bob and others really around the lower middle income countries and the infrastructure not being there to do these sort of rapid real world evidence type studies still, and so that feeds into the trust issue. And you know, some of the vaccines which were being provided to these countries or coming to these countries was coming from sort of pre-qualifications from WHO or COVAX, but that there wasn't the same level of ability to then evaluate those. And I think we're still in a position now of for some of the vaccines knowing about, you know, is there a risk of the thrombosis with thrombocytopenia in these countries or not? Because there's almost no data come out. And so being able to have that ability in the infrastructure is still a big question in some countries, and particularly LMICs. So whereas in some, you know, we could do things quickly. Even within the country, thinking how could it have been better for us? I mean, there's still more data that could have been connected together, potentially from say. From some of our surveys, like our population surveys, which would have maybe given us even more information on both risk groups to identify who are at risk of more serious COVID. And I think some of the population with learning difficulties didn't get picked up early on. But also, you know, confounder adjustment in studies as well could be even better done. I'm trying to spot if there's anything else. So there's the speed that, and I think the public-private working together side of things, I think, you know, that's the very fact that we're having this meeting is kind of looking to see how that can further develop, and that could be that's a sort of a plus coming out. I think that is continuing to develop and to work out how that can work, so that we don't duplicate. One thing that perhaps didn't work great always in the UK was it was really difficult, particularly on the safety side, to keep on top of everyone who was doing studies. And some groups came in to do studies, and we just didn't know about it. And as hard as we tried, we're working with the MHRA and everyone, some things came sort of left field, and kind of keeping on top of that wasn't easy. So that coordination side probably still needs more work. I think that was everything, yeah.
But overall, you feel that the real-world evidence studies were valuable in informing policy,
the decision. The decision, when it comes to the decisions, the interval between the doses question, the speed at which you sort of relaxed the non-pharmaceutical interventions, that pathway to opening up, and reassurance as the new variants came along that things were still okay. The real world evidence was really important in all of those. And I was kind of in on the meetings with the JCVI and so on. You could see it feeding in.
Have we finished the groups, or have we got? No, we've got one more group.
I don't know.
But Steve, you've got a point.
Just one quick comment. I think that this presumes that what was done during the pandemic was sustainable, and I think if you looked at the way some of the regulators and vaccine safety surveillance public health people looked on TV when they were giving reports, it looked like they were on the 20th hour that day, every day for 7 days during the week. So I'm wondering, maybe we could think about, is there, what resources really need to be dedicated to make this kind of response and data interpretation ongoing sustainable?
That's okay. I just have a couple quick points to add because a lot of it was already discussed. I mean, one, just to really call out the success in the U.S. with the pausing of the Janssen vaccine with the signals regarding to TTS and, those warnings being added very quickly and the guidance and education and outreach that occurred. And then finally, the preferential recommendation for mRNA vaccines, because that probably was very important to saving lives in the U.S. When there was an alternative vaccine available in that case. And I think another point that kind of got brought up, and maybe not specifically in this way, with the use of, that I think someone mentioned about using real-world evidence, to inform authorizations, which is, obviously difficult. You have to have the authorization and the use to generate the real-world evidence, but you do often have that happening in different countries. So a good example would be in the UK. There was use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for months at the same time as being evaluated FDA, which eventually never received approval. But we could think about better coordination of data on between countries and allowing real-world data from one country to help inform decisions in another country. With regard to Israel, totally agree that was a success, but how do we make that a more equitable platform, right? Because it was very specific generation of, vaccine effectiveness data for, a very specific vaccine brand. And then a couple other thoughts that I had just as people were speaking is definitely more about vulnerable subgroups and our ability to produce data for those groups quickly. Because I'm always struck by the fact that the vaccination programs are rolled out to vulnerable populations first very often, but then they're the last populations to actually get effectiveness data. So the healthcare workers, long-term care, residents is very difficult to identify in secondary data, frail assessments of frailty in the elderly, et cetera. And I think another one that I was thinking that we needed to call out as a success is I think we should recognize the efforts of IVAC and the View Hub and WHO and the coordination of all that effectiveness data on that website, which is just extremely useful to have had that platform to discuss it and to be able to easily access all the studies that were ongoing and had been published in some way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some interesting points there.
I think we'll just play off of what everyone else has said. So I think we largely agree, and we thought that one of the key positives was the rapidity with which data was able to be generated. But one of the problems was that it was hard to contextualize it at individual country levels because it was coming out so quickly and decisions were being made very quickly. And so one country may make a choice based on one local study or be influenced by a decision another country made, rather than looking at the global context of the data. So there was an example given in South Africa where one local study that generated data on mild to moderate disease influenced a decision locally to essentially refuse millions of doses of vaccine just as it was being rolled out, without contextualizing the need for a vaccine against a severe disease and all the other data that was generated against that. And so many people died as a result of this decision. And that also speaks to the other points that were made about communication. So just the data aggregation, looking at the global data set, someone putting it all together and helping people understand the global data available, and then also contextualizing it locally, but then also the ability to have skilled communication around that, because obviously there's a lot of different people communicating decisions to the public, and there's a different levels of acceptance and understanding of that data, and being able to kind of make sure that information is accessible to people making decisions for themselves and at the country level. And I think those were kind of key points we had. There was some other, one other point we had was it's very hard sometimes for other companies coming in to generate real world evidence when maybe one or two big players have all the patients. And so it's very hard to actually set up systems where you can actually generate evidence about your data. If you're a smaller company coming in later, it's much harder to generate observational data because we're not randomizing patients. We're just simply collecting data on those who choose this vaccine, and there may be very few, and then it's hard to generate robust data with smaller sample sizes. So.
Yeah, I think a group has sort of identified that as well. You know, the mRNA vaccines are quick if you want to are very good if you want something quick in the field. You know, in the face of pandemic, they may not be the best option for long-term protection against a broad range of, you know, and have we bought into this model because of the rapidity with which the vaccine platform can make a vaccine without perhaps, you know, evaluating further. Hector, you want to come in?
One positive thing we did not discuss, at least it helped me certainly, the CEPI sponsored project in providing all the data on effectiveness with a very brief summary of those data and clear rules on what to present. It helped me. I didn't have to go back to the literature to review every time we wanted to make an investigation. So if we could continue that type of CITREP initiative, I think it would be great. Appreciated.
Any other points? I mean, there's some really interesting points that have been brought up, some the same, and some from completely different perspectives. I trust somebody is making some nice notes of the... Thanks, Kat. Very informative, interesting discussion.